All right, chapter 6. It was a huge relief to be out of school. It never sat right with me. My free spirit was not meant to be confined to an institution, and I was just grateful to have graduated early and somewhat shocked at how well I had done. My plan was to fly to the States, visit relatives, then do some puppet ministry, and maybe get a job before I flew back to Israel and do my military service. I had never been to the States, and I was somewhat intrigued by what I would find. I was a wide eyed 17-year-old girl. It was the first time I was free from the shackles of my family, and it felt good. I was excited to be given the chance to do puppet ministry for a few months. The family who had invited me were incredibly kind and made sure that everyone knew that I was from the Holy Land. I was treated like royalty by the churches we visited. Because of my Israeli status, I was the closest thing to Jesus these devoted churchgoers of Oregon had known. I was asked to say prayers over them in Hebrew, and the pastors would often come up to me and talk about my life in Jerusalem. This wasn't quite what I had expected. Puppet ministry is great because it's exactly that. Puppets do the talking and the singing. You get to hide behind a set design and not draw too much attention to yourself. In fact, no attention to yourself. That might have been the case when I did it in Jerusalem, but not so in Oregon. I was a Holy Land celebrity. It has to be said that for all their faults, Americans are in fact the most generous people on the planet. Along with their loud voices and big portions came a very big heart. I had never been as well looked after as I was by the Christians in America. Envelopes with money were shoved in my pockets, and I wasn't allowed to argue. After a summer of ministry, I was meant to settle down and get a job so I could return to Israel with a bit of money. That was the plan, at least. Thing is, the thought of flipping burgers for more than an afternoon filled me with dread. I needed something with meaning, somewhere I could serve Jesus, not customers. The answer came in the form of Brian. He had come to visit our youth group in Jerusalem for a few years and spoke of some Easter camps we ran. He was a charismatic man with a passion for young people and for their salvation. When news reached him that I was staying in Southern Oregon, he called me and told me that he knew exactly what I should do. There was a training center for young adults in Portland. It would be perfect for me. He knew that I would love it just as much as the young Australian guy Steve, who he had already sent there. It sounded promising. The thought of going somewhere that had led Brian's blessing made sense to me. He was good friends with John in Jerusalem, so I completely trusted him. Only a couple of days later, I said goodbye to the wonderful family that had been hosting me and got on a bus to Portland. I ended up staying there for the rest of my 6-month visit. A lot of things happened in those 6 months. Probably the most profound thing was that I fell in love and had my first boyfriend. This young Aussie surfer that Brian had mentioned to me was the first guy to be brave enough to let me know he liked me. This was so new, and I had no idea how to respond. Thankfully, our love and devotion to Jesus was our connecting point. Our time together was spent talking about the Bible and how we wanted to serve Jesus in whichever way he called us. Purity was a must. We both agreed that we would only kiss once we were truly committed to each other, and we would only do that once God told us to. It was a long wait. In the meantime, we prayed a lot, talked a lot, and shared Bible verses. I remember feeling so torn. I really wanted to be with Steve, and I felt that God wanted us together. I just hoped that Steve would be okay with never touching my body once we got married. I didn't mind the thought of us kissing once God gave us the go-ahead, but that would be all. My body was totally out of bounds. It was faulty, it was ungodly, and surely our spiritual connection was enough to sustain us. After a couple of months, God finally gave us the go-ahead for us to kiss, which funnily enough coincided with us staying at this idyllic log cabin in the mountains, tucked away in the deep snowdrifts. We were being hosted by a wonderful woman from the church who adored both me and Steve, and she had invited us, along with other young people from our training group, to stay for a weekend. The log cabin was exactly the way a log cabin should be. It oozed romance. It had lofts and wooden beams and a roaring fire day and night. I was pretty thankful that God had finally deemed it kosher for us to have our first kiss. Steve wanted to show me that he had meant business and that he wasn't taking this lightly. He had purchased a gold ring. It was not to be confused with an engagement ring. This was a promise ring. He presented this ring with a heartfelt explanation of his desire to follow God's will first and foremost, and that he had every intention of being with me forever, but that he couldn't make that promise yet. It's exactly what I needed to hear. As the snow slowly fell outside the log cabin, we kissed for the first time, my very first kiss. It was a beautiful moment, and I felt like I was the luckiest girl alive. I had crossed over into the world of having a boyfriend, and I couldn't think of a better place than being on a mountain, tucked away in deep snow, the stars shining down, Mount Hood watching us, and as far as I possibly could be from my father and three brothers. Steve and I were thrilled about our new status. Any free time, we would borrow a car and drive down to the Oregon coast. There we would walk along the beach and talk about our future. He was heading back to his beloved Australia to study. I had to go back to Israel to do my army service. But we knew that God was bigger than that. If he wanted us to be together, then something as insignificant as distance wouldn't be an issue. Our love, and more importantly, his love, was big enough to span across the miles. Despite the good intentions of the people in the church, I was feeling more and more uneasy about what I saw going on in there. The American version of Christianity was so different to what I was used to back home. Church was so formal, so much about how we looked. The final straw came one day when, after the morning service, I met a homeless man outside the church. He was a Vietnam veteran, and he was a broken man. I reminded him of his daughter, and we talked for hours. I walked across the parking lot to the supermarket and bought him some of his favorite food to eat. He was so grateful and ate every piece in silence. I invited him to come along to the evening service. I had already changed out of my church clothes after the morning service, and because I had been talking to this man for the whole day, I hadn't had a chance to get out of my shorts and sweatshirt and back into my dressier clothes. He asked me to sit with him during the service instead of sitting in my regular spot at the front. Once the sermon was over and the pastor asked people to come forward for prayer, the man stood up. He started going to the front of the church and turned to ask if I would come with him. I was happy to sit with him, and as he got prayed for, and I really felt that the church would be able to help him with his broken heart as well as give him some practical assistance. It was such a wonderful feeling to finally have a humanitarian outlet to all the churchy stuff we'd been doing. I loved theology and was very good at quoting scripture, but it all seemed empty if we didn't do something practical with it. And this day I was elated. This was the gospel. This was exactly what I'd wanted with my time at the church to be. Once the man was offered a place to stay for the night by a family at the church, I ran up to the pastor to debrief him about what had just happened. Instead of sharing my excitement or rejoicing with me for having saved a lost soul, I was told off. I was told off for wearing shorts to church service, for being a bad example to the young people in the church, and for disrespecting the rules. It hurt. It really hurt. This was so completely foreign to me and would never happen in Jerusalem. Every part of me knew that the pastor was wrong and that he had totally missed the point of what had just happened. I remained silent, knowing full well that it was a battle I could never win. This was the American church, so focused on the superficial they had lost sight of the heart of God. Another thing that was really hard for me during this time was the obsession the church leaders had in making me speak in tongues. In their world, you could only be a true Christian if you had the Holy Spirit living inside you. And the only proof of this internal gift was if you spoke in tongues. Now, the problem was that I didn't. Everyone else in the leadership corps spoke in tongues except for me. It had never been an issue for me before, and no one, as far as I knew, spoke in tongues in my church back home. My parents did, but it wasn't something that was really talked about. It was no big deal. No one got extra brownie points for their ability to prove that the Holy Spirit resided in them. Except for here in America. Oh, how they wanted me to have the full Jesus experience. I got prayed for hours. I had hands laid on me by all the church leaders. Demons got rebuked for blocking the Spirit to descend on me. Every so often in the middle of the prayer, I would get a rather big smack on my forehead in the hope that I would fall over and be slain in the Spirit. This was a true sign from God that things were happening. Thing is, nothing happened. I didn't budge. I was given words that I had to repeat over and over until the tongues would spill out of me, and they never did. Something very strange happened, though. The pastor had asked for prayer as he was going through a hard time. We didn't know it at the time, but it turned out that he was having an affair with one of the youth group teenagers. No wonder he was having a hard time and wanted prayer. We all stood around him and prayed for him. The leaders all had their hands on him, and us younger leaders had our hands reached out towards him. After a while, I put my hand on him as well, and just as I did, he fell straight back, completely flat on his back. Everyone was stunned. There was total silence. How had that happened? How had the pastor been slain in the Spirit by a girl who didn't have the Spirit in her? It went against everything they knew to be true. As my time in the States went on, I started feeling quite unwell. I wasn't sick. I just felt off somehow and not myself. There was fogginess in my head that I wasn't used to, a kind of buzzing in my body, a coating in my mouth. My body was tired. I was exhausted by the afternoon. Not once did I connect it to the way I was eating. In Jerusalem, I ate salads every day. We had very little money, so my mother would stock up on vegetables at the local shuk a few times a week. She would then roll her market trolley home on the bus up the 4 flights of stairs. Our dinners would often be lentils with rice, boiled cauliflower with a massive serve of salad. Israeli salads are mainly tiny dices of tomatoes and cucumbers with a hint of raw onion, a big splash of olive oil, and a squeeze of lemon. My mother would always add salad leaves into ours as well. We ate this every day. I don't think I ate a salad once in my 9 months in the States. At the time, I thought nothing of it, but not one item on my plate could be recognized as a specific food. There were crumbed pieces of unidentified meat, a few pieces of reconstituted deep fried potatoes, a sauce of some variety out of a jar. It was served on a plate with a knife and a fork, so it must be food. Breakfast were donuts that were donated to the church. On the weekends, it was pancakes that were made from a mix that only needed water added to it, served with a syrup that said maple on the bottle, but tasted nothing like the maple syrup my mother would buy when we had a bit of extra money. Lunches were sandwiches made with bread that defied gravity. It had no whey in it at all, and it tasted sweet. They would add a cheese slice that was orange. Orange? How could cheese be orange? And slices of meat that didn't look like anything I'd ever seen. Sometimes the meat even had a smiley face on it. It was all new to me. I happily ate it, and I felt exhausted. The solution to this exhaustion, which I had put down to our very early prayer sessions, was coffee. Bitter coffee that was transformed into a heavenly mix by adding a mysterious white mixture they referred to as creamer. It came in every flavor you could possibly imagine, and it was so easy to drink. I would make a few every day when my energy levels dropped. Soft drinks were also everywhere. I figured they must be handed out free at the shops because people drank them like I drank water in Jerusalem. I found the flavors so harsh. It hurt my throat, but often that was all there was to drink. Now, this is strange to me as well. Why did I feel like I had so little energy? In Jerusalem, I would spend hours walking every day. I walked to school, I walked to the YMCA, I walked to church, I walked to the old city and back with my friends. Surely all that walking should have made me tired. We didn't have a car until a couple of months before I had left for the States, so my whole life until then had meant getting around by foot and bus, except for in Sweden, where I got to ride my bike. Here I was in the States, never having to walk more than a few meters, and yet I was exhausted. It didn't make sense. Along with the fogginess in my head and the exhaustion, the rest of me started to change. I was so switched off from my body that I only noticed the changes when the clothes that I had bought no longer fit me. I just didn't feel like myself anymore in my head or in my body. And not once did I connect it to the stuff I was putting into my mouth that Americans called food. Not once. It was a very unsettling time for me. I was used to having a sharp mind. Now it felt as if it wasn't quite connecting. I knew that I had to make a decision very soon about my departure. Everyone around me was telling me to stay and that my home was now in the States. They were telling me that I didn't have to do my army service in Israel, that I could serve God much better at the church. I had connected really well with the young people in the church, and they were begging me to stay. A lot of them came from incredibly abusive homes with stories that were impossible to process. 2 sisters being used in Masonic rituals with their dad watching as men took turns raping them. Another girl being forced by her mother to sleep with her stepfather. Children coming to church and not having eaten for days. Stories that were so far from my reality. Suicide bombs on buses in Jerusalem seemed like nothing compared to this. My only way to respond was to listen to these stories and scrambled eggs for the hungry kids. And it made me feel so far away from home. Home that now meant military service. Military service. Me doing military service. The thought seemed so foreign and bizarre. I had spent most of my life in Jerusalem in a very small bubble. A bubble filled with friends from around the world and local Arabs and Palestinians. I really had no connection to Israelis at all. Most of my interactions consisted of me avoiding comments being yelled at me from guys on buses or from taxi drivers who seemed keen to give me a free ride. I didn't actually have any Israeli friends at all, come to think of it, and my Hebrew was basic, really basic. It was enough to get around with, but to actually have to function, like to have a role in the army, it seemed impossible. Steve, however, was very clear about his future. Nothing was going to keep him from the northern beaches of Sydney that were calling him to return. He was going to be a physical education teacher, and he had the next 4 years of his life mapped out. He would be leaving in the middle of January. I decided that the obvious way to get an answer to my questions was to pray and fast. That's what my mother had done all those years before. So I fasted for 10 days. My friends were impressed by my willpower, but convinced me that I would need coffee to keep me going. So I had 10 jittery days of fasting. It was far from a spiritual experience. No answer came, but I longed to feel like my old self again, to walk the streets of Jerusalem, to feel the sun, to eat salads, to sit at Liz's table. I needed to do that. And then I needed to face my fear of joining the masses and becoming a soldier. Steve and I had a farewell party together, with both of us beaming at the thought of going back to our real lives. We knew full well that God would reunite us if it was His will. Our friends cried as we said goodbyes. The church would never quite be the same without the young Aussie surfer and the girl from the Holy Land.